Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll. This is Black Cats Run. So, you're not happy with your results in your fitness, in your racing, you're not improving. What are you going to do? Well, most of the time the answer is it's time to kick it up a notch. Today's episode, what does train, don't strain really mean? And are we likely to ever see any kind of a meaningful scale of sea change around this attitude that the only way to improve is to be willing to push yourself to the next level, and that it's the intensity that others do that's holding us back? I don't know. Probably not. But let's get into today's episode. In my mind, train, don't strain is a phrase that is best attributed, or should be most commonly attributed, to Arthur Lydiard. And I think, like a lot of sayings or truisms, they just don't really get examined or considered. And people tend to sort of throw these things around and then just continue to do exactly what they're going to do. I think it's very common to look around and see people talking about how they're doing X, Y, or Z different in their training, and they're just not actually doing anything different. The only thing that's different is that they're acting in their mind like they're training in a different way. And one of the ways that we see this most commonly is in the misrepresentation of Zone 2 training, right? Or Zone 1 training, or basically this idea of training below threshold, where people don't recognize what the data actually says threshold is. They just impose their ideas of what training intensity are. They take this new framework of articulation, and then they just take what they're doing and they repackage it into this new style of speech and continue with what they believe to be true. And, you know, you get into that interesting question of, well, whomever is at the best level, how do you really question or suggest that they're not doing things correctly, right? Well, I think that that's more complicated than that, because, you know, just because people have hit performances, are they really being consistent with those performances? Are they actually performing to the best of their potential on the days when they really ideally would like to? Are they getting injured? You know, how healthy or sustainable is their engagement with sport? Are they taking supplements, right, or special sports supplements, performance-enhancing drugs? You know, how much of a role does that play in terms of their ability to engage with the training and in order to create performance in racing, right? So just because elite people seem to be doing things in a certain way is by no means a case closed proof of concept, because there have always been people at whatever the current top level for any point in time historically in any given sport. There have always been people at the top level. And so then you could say always that, well, there's nothing to figure out because we've got the top people and they're doing the stuff. And yet what we see over time is that, you know, there are changes to that. And I think that the changes are oftentimes, though, been changes just towards, you know, how do you increase the level of, you know, in the vernacular sense, intensity of your training? How do you train harder? How do you do more watts, right? How do you lift more weight? How do you jump higher? How do you train more frequently? How do you do more? And the idea that, well, the ability to do more is proportional to the ability to improve. Let's say you're a runner and last spring you were running 1,000 meter repeats at 5-minute pace, okay? And now it's about 12 months later. Let's say you're running 1,000 meter repeats at about 5-minute pace. You haven't improved. So to me, the question would be, why aren't you running faster for those 1,000 meter repeats? something in there is not working. Okay. And yet for people, if they are even willing to consider the possibility that what they're doing isn't sufficiently effective, and obviously the confirmation bias is overwhelming, where the bigger people see themselves in terms of their status as goldfish in their whatever their relative goldfish bowl is, the more likely it is to be the case that they're just not going to be receptive to the possibility that they're not doing well. Or if they can't, they're going to say, well, what separates me from these other people is that they're going faster, they're doing more, so I need to be able to do more. And that's the idea, right? And to me, the question then becomes, why is it to people that the grass is always greener on the other side? And why does that, in this sports context, equate to people assuming that always the answer is the training load, meaning volume plus frequency plus intensity, needs to get to a point where the net fatigue and strain is greater? This just input-output equation that people fundamentally accept as true, right? Why is that embedded? Is that really valid? I don't think so. But if it's not valid, then why is it so pervasive, right? Why can't we overcome that? So I saw an article in the New York Times at the end of last week, and the title of the article was, "Can Weed Improve a Workout? Some exercisers say cannabis eases their pain and anxiety and makes fitness more fun." Now, this opens up a whole can of beans. I don't think I have the moral standing to make judgments about people and, what kind of substances they, want to use or avoid or whatever. I mean, that's such a presumptive worldview for anybody to sit and judgment on that. And I'm not going to do that. And I don't really care about that. To me, that's not really a very interesting topic. But I think what is genuinely fascinating about this is the way in which just the headline alone, and never mind some of the stuff discussed in the article, tells us so much about our attitudes, about how we think fitness works, what it means to engage with fitness. And also it says so much about our obliviousness to the fact that some of these answers are just really kind of right there. And in my opinion, don't require a big intellectual leap to grasp. But people just again, that confirmation bias that, well, those people are better than me because they do these bigger numbers in the following criteria. I need to be hitting those numbers to become like them, is just overwhelming. So what does this emergent norm of people now using weed, or let's just say, call a spade, of people basically dosing themselves up with THC in order to make their training possible, what does this tell us about training? So I think one thing that it points to is that there's this belief that it's what we can't get ourselves to do of our sort of own natural accord that separates us from what we imagine or would love to be able to do. The history of amphetamine use in sports, also points to that, right? And it's kind of this interesting phenomenon because, it is true that if you can alter the way in which you experience exertion, you can perhaps increase the numbers that you can generate. But you're not really increasing the efficiency with which you can generate those numbers. See, that's a different issue. But the way, if you can change your subjective relationship to the work you're doing, you can produce more work. But that's only valuable from a training perspective if your understanding of training is simply, the dose makes the poison here, which is to say that the more intensive, the bigger the numbers you hit, the bigger the response, the more likely, and you have to get to those numbers and then you'll become those numbers kind of thing. But that's not actually the way our physiology changes, right? It all operates around efficiency, right? Which is the tipping point of where does it go from being easy to hard. That's what is determinant in who is quotes elite, who is above average, who is below average. and who is just struggling to get off the couch. But people don't like that concept because it conflicts with our beliefs in the fantasy of willpower. Just in the same way that people don't like to question standardized assessments of intelligence, right? And well, because if you are performing well by that metric, then of course you're going to like that, because then you are going to be socially praised and rewarded and celebrated. So you have every incentive imaginable, basically, to, want to buy into and sing the praises of that evaluation. And then the other people who maybe question that, well, who are they to know, because they're dumb, they're not intelligent enough. But it's these fixed quantities of capacity and ability that are so significant, right? And so in that sense too, I think we perhaps see a recrudescence in the podcast of another instance of survivorship bias, where the people who are most successful are the only data points that are being considered. And what we should be saying is that, well, it's the fact that nobody else can do that training suggests that there's something wrong with the training, that the training that they're doing is actually ineffective, which is difficult to grasp as a concept. And I understand that, but that just because people are doing something and then they're ending up as being successful doesn't actually prove that that's the right way to do it. And then what people's response is, well, how can we reinforce that practice? Well, everybody else is being taken down by virtue of doing that training. So really what we should be learning is that training is not effective, but we have created this worldview in which we don't see it as about this like capacity of efficiency and raising our ease point. We see it in terms of willpower and mental toughness. And if I've talked about this before on the podcast many times, but it bears repeating because it is such an insipid, in my opinion, belief in our culture around sports, but also performance in general. Much like the way people who test as intelligent will love the test, people who are evaluated as having unique mental capacity for willpower and toughness will also value that system, because that celebrates them and it feeds into their ego, and then they benefit socially from being perceived as these people of status, and there's economic rewards for that, right? If that's can be your identity, then you can lend legitimacy to products that are fake, and people will buy those things, and there's a whole economy that is driving this behavior too. But we also are seeing that there's this belief that it's hard to go hard because it gets too hard, kind of circular, unending logic. And it's like, well, we need to make it easier so we can go hard. Because in this, article, we're talking about some people who are like, exercise is too hard, so I need to take these drugs so I can go hard because it gets too hard, kind of thing, right? And so if we focus back a little bit more on that THC example, right, specifically it was like an exercise class where the instructor was like being really demonstrative and screaming and yelling at people, and they left and they didn't want to go back. But now they can get high and tolerate it. So now it's like, oh, this is great. So, I mean, if you're taking like drugs like that in order to engage in environment, like I would argue that's the definition of unhealthy. Setting aside the social issues around recreational drugs and whatnot, and America has a weird history with that. I mean, at one point, there was a constitutional amendment banning the consumption of alcohol, for instance, right? And yet it's also the case that especially this time of year, say in like New England, great time of year to go around and look at, what alcohol producers made the most profits, because the, beer cans and, hard alcohol bottles, they just litter the side of the road in every sense of the word. It's unbelievable. It's like an absolute avalanche, right? And So we live in a country where in the United States, at one point in time, there was enough social momentum to make alcohol illegal. And yet now here we are with people drinking so much when they're driving that, you could build a house out of the amount of, alcohol container refuse you find on the side of the road every spring, just going over a few miles of roadway. Horrifying, really, when you think about how dangerous that is. If hopefully you're not somebody who's getting intoxicated or swigging any kind of alcohol while you're driving. But we have a weird, right? My point here is that we have a very strange relationship with these kinds of things in our culture where, we have this duality of things are both unacceptable and totally permissible at the same time. And that would probably be a totally different podcast, right? Besides this one. But if we just focus on the idea of, like, in this case, recreational drugs, right? We're making a distinction. I wouldn't consider, so just because people are taking THC and then are anecdotally saying it makes it easier for me to exercise, I wouldn't consider that a performance enhancing drug because it's altering people's ability to engage with something. It's not fundamentally elevating them to a different point of, like, objectively otherwise unattainable physical performance. But what this shows, though, is number one, exercise needs to be easier. Okay? So people are supplementing with THC because the exercise isn't easy enough. And yet they're supplementing it because the exercise is hard. So it's like, I need to do this exercise that's hard, but I also need it to be easy so I can do it. Okay? So another way you could achieve that is just by making the exercise easier. But no, people don't want to do that because the grass is greener on the other side here. You've got to, hit those bigger numbers, and that's the only way you're going to be a better athlete or you're going to get these benefits. And number two, we need to listen to the body. We need to be able to process our physiological, psychophysio symptoms that are a product of exercise and physical activity. The central governor of the brain is actively trying to regulate intensity by specifically doing exactly this, by engaging with and working on, right, raising awareness to the conscious mind of what we're doing by creating stress and distress, right? And but we need to anesthetize ourselves to that, right? And it's funny because a lot of THC culture is this idea of, like, connectedness and awareness and understanding of the world and empathy. But I mean, here's clearly an instance of people just saying, I'm going to take this to just turn parts of my brain off, essentially. Number three, I think, is showing that belief that, like, the more challenging is something, the better it is, unequivocally, period, the end, right? And that there's no further discussion to be had. And in the article, like, there's no real, space, in my opinion, given to the idea of, like, are these exercise strategies, programs, interventions that these people are applying, are they messed up because the only way they can engage with them is with this? But instead it's like, hey, this is great. Here's another thing validating, why, THC should be an important day-to-day supplement, like, the way caffeine is. Although you could also say with caffeine, right, if you use caffeine to supplement or make exercise possible, is that a good thing, right? Well, I think one question there would be, well, to what extent does something override the central governor's otherwise natural regulation, right? And I guess it depends on how much of a stimulant response you're getting from caffeine. So that, but that becomes, right, tricky to try to make distinctions because you get into this space of, well, are we making judgments about how people should or shouldn't engage with things besides just fitness, but how should they engage with their sense of self and the world, etc. So let's circle back to the survivorship bias at play here, right? It's those, right, survivorship bias, World War II, the bombers that come back have holes in them. We need to put more armor over those holes. How can we, bolster those things, right? But the reality is you needed to put the armor in all of the other places because the fact that those ones came back showed that, that wasn't the issue, right? And so in this case, I'm saying the bullet holes we don't recognize are the, damage done by, overly aggressive, intensive, destructive training practices. And that if we shift that perspective and recognize the survivorship bias, then, what could that look like in terms of thinking about training and the process of training, right? How can this occur? Well, I think one of the things to recognize is that some people, right, are more likely to sort of achieve or be successful here because they have a higher lactate threshold, essentially just to start with. Now, whether that's due to circumstances around birth and people's genetics and their growth and development, whether that has to do with the level of activity in their lifestyle, before they do any kind of organized sports. The reality is you see these distinctions at play, right? And if it's just common sense that if people are going to their sports practice, their sports conditioning practice, and they're just like not getting tired, well, they must be, right, more efficient. They must not be as aerobically stressful for them, or as they might not be driving into as much of that kind of anaerobic glycolysis. And so as a consequence of that, for those people, that makes everything that much easier, makes it that much more manageable. And then they are, as a consequence, that much more likely to accidentally get the good adaptations that we want to see, right? Conversely, who is least likely to improve or be successful? Well, that would have to then be the athletes at the other end of that spectrum, the athletes who have the lowest threshold. And they're the people, right? These people who are the least fit are being flogged into trying to keep up with the most fit. So who's actually training the hardest, right? Because this original grass is greener on the other side is like you take the hyper motivated, like there's no person more likely to have bad outcomes in sport than a hyper motivated person who is too much of a gap aerobically between where they currently are and what they're being asked to do, because they're just going to learn this incredible level of intensity, and their motivation is going to drive them to really, and the expectations of the environment are going to combine to drive them to try to emulate as much as possible their understanding of like the numbers that the best people are doing. But that's just not really going to be effective. And so as a consequence, why is this? So like they're actually the people who are training the hardest. Now they're not producing the most exciting numbers. And within that socially constructed environment, you're taught to feel that you suck, right? Because you're not posting the best numbers and you're far off the numbers and you're terrible, right? But the reality is the numbers that actually matter, right? Their heart rates are higher, their muscles, the degree of muscular pain is greater, right? Their blood lactate concentration is going to be higher, right? Like the numbers that actually like dictate or help us think about what stress is, they're way higher on that scale. But that's not recognized because for coaches, if you want to feel competent in yourself, you're going to focus on the athletes who are the best because that to you is proof of concept. And for some reason, people just don't look at the athletes who don't do well, because the other thing is it's lazy. As coaches don't want to try to figure out a different way to do it, right? So if they just say, well, these people aren't good enough because they're mentally weak, that's great. You've washed your hands of that, right? The athlete is the problem, not the methodology, okay? And that's not the point of coaching. Like that's really not the point of coaching. That's called being a dictator or being a tyrant, right? And if that's what you're in for, then don't be a coach, because you have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that people have a good experience and that people should go away from whatever program or camp or whatever it is that you run, and they should want to engage with that more, and they should be in a better position. Even if it's a marginal improvement, they should be in a better position to engage with that and be successful going forward. And so if we look at all the indicators of pushing for too numbers that are just too much stress, what do we see? We see pain, we see injury, we see the kind of paralysis that you get with being muscularly trashed. I mean, I still have a clear recollection of doing some 8x quarter mile repeats with a 60-second recovery, returning from the winter vacation, where guess what? Nobody really had access to a space to even stay in contact to any degree with that kind of velocity. And then being so unbelievably trashed, worse than anything, worse than doing marathon, worse than, the time I did the combo event of the 50 kilometer run and 150 mile gravel ride, like way worse than that, like as bad as it can be, right? And you're pushing yourself to that point. And then you go beyond those immediate things and mental health issues, self-loathing, disillusionment. I also think that, eating disorders incur, right? Where people start questioning, well, the problem is I'm too heavy. That's the issue, right? I can't do this because I'm too heavy. And, reality is once you're within a certain ballpark, losing weight isn't really going to do anything. You're just going to lose muscle and you're just going to lose power and you're going to be no better off than where you were before. But, that's not how people see that. So should we then be administering all of these lagging or flagging athletes? Should we be dosing these athletes up on THC so that they can engage with this better? Well, what's that going to do? Well, that's just going to make it worse because you're just going to induce further application of the process that is gross overreaching. And then all of those things that I just listed and, other things besides will just be incurred to a greater extent. Let's go back to the example of the pain-free cycling time trial test where the test subjects who had their pain receptors basically flipped off, couldn't walk, and got just obliterated in performance by the people who went in, unfiltered. Because that sense of distress is a pacing mechanism. It actually improves performance. So working within that central governor limit allows people to improve performance. And the problem is people use intervals. In my opinion, the problem with using intervals the way most people do is they're just using it to try to take something that is you can't do and then try to basically trick themselves into doing it anyway, right? Taking something that's an impossible, unreasonable effort and let me just dose it down small enough and now I can do this, right? But if you take one pill and you break it into 8 pieces and you take one every 60 seconds, you've still basically taken the same pill, right? Maybe it somehow improves your ability it makes it worse, if anything, right? Because it's making it more likely for you to take that pill, right? You don't recognize that you've taken the whole pill. You feel like, oh, I've been reasonable, I've been modest, and I've been controlled in what I've done. But there's the bias that, well, it's supposed to be painful. It's not supposed to be painful. The whole point of the central governor is to generate the sense of distress to prevent us from getting to that point in the first place. But we make it painful by inducing those who are insufficiently prepared, if you will, to keep up with those for whom maybe the training load is a little bit more important. So that, hierarchy of athletes, of the good athletes and the bad athletes, that's not a natural thing. You're not recognizing who's an athlete. That's always drove me crazy when I was, went through the phase in my life where I was coaching at youth level of, other coaches talking about, well, they're an athlete and who's an athlete. I mean, that's just whole mindset to me is flawed because you're basically saying that everybody else has no potential and you're just looking for people for whom already are meeting whatever you somehow believe is the standard of excellence. And then you just take those people and then you don't actually do anything with them either, right? So you're not actually doing anything in my opinion, as a coach at all. And, in this sense, like the coach is just like, taking these people, and then I think it's then sort of rewarding them for nothing, if you will. And then I think, ironically, sometimes the best athletes then become the people who are lazy or indifferent, right? And I mean best athlete in the sense of the people whom in a given environment are finding everything to be the least challenging and the least stressful. Well, because they're not being challenged, right? They're the least challenged, right? So they're living the good life because everything is easy for them. And then they're also told they're awesome, and they're told everybody else is worse, and they're watching people struggle and not keep up with them. That's a really unhealthy environment to like create as a formative experience for people. And so in this sense, like the coach is just like tilting at windmills, right? They're not coaching athletes. Like they're living in this fantasy world. The quote unquote, the pain is really something that should only be happening when we're doing racing. And in that situation, the situational arousal compensates for that. And we like the body will sort of like, I don't want to like, glamorize it or give it more significance than it will, but you can be working really hard and feel great and be charged up. And, you're in that state of like, I feel really engaged and this is rewarding, right? And so even though you're struggling and uncomfortable and you're breathing hard, I wouldn't really call it pain, because pain is this thing that is just something where you're doing everything you can to escape it. But when you're doing a competition, if you're well prepared, and your mindset around what your goal is, and then working towards that goal within the competition, you're not going to experience that as pain. Like you're going to you want that's adversity now, and you want that adversity because that's literally what's making it rewarding. So, the simple answer to this is like if we slow down, we can achieve everything that the THC in the case of this article is supposed to induce or achieve, because now we are getting the right level of adaptive stimulus. Because the fourth issue is that like even if you're using this THC and it's enabling you to do these workouts, it still doesn't matter because you're not training at an intensity that's going to be productive anyway. And so just the belief that higher levels of challenge equals higher level of resulting performance is false. It's a very easy concept to think through and rationalize, and that's why it's been so popular. Another dynamic of this, though, which I think is so THC would be like a definable non-placebo intervention, but we can also placebo ourselves into trying to simulate the satisfaction of competition in training. So to prove this point, let's ask a question, right? What is mastery? So one way you might say that mastery means that you're at the highest level of your craft and you can do X, Y, and Z, and then people listen to you and blah, blah, blah. And it is one of the things when I got into my professional career as in education, right? This is a term that used to be popular 10, 15 years ago, was master teacher this, master teacher that. Who's a master teacher? I don't know. That's sort of gone by the wayside, as so often happens with so many of these kinds of things. But like this idea that it was like a benchmark or a status. Mastery is not actually a fixed point, okay? What mastery looks like in any given area has changed dramatically over time, because what's possible based on accumulated knowledge and collective learning is also changing. So mastery is not an actual defined fixed point. I believe it's a feeling, and it occurs when our level of skill is, at its, most proximal point to failure relative to the challenge we're taking on. So, I try to encourage people to, according to LT, or point out that there's no evidence to support the dual LT hypothesis, right? So, to let go of the second lactate threshold, right? You might be thinking, well, this is a non sequitur. What does this have to do with mastery? Well, I'm going to explain this. So people, by and large, do not like listening to being told that LT2 doesn't exist. Well, why would that be the case? Like, it shouldn't be an issue, because telling somebody, yeah, training like that is more uncomfortable and hard, and it's not productive. You can train easier, be more comfortable, and improve more. So why wouldn't people like that? Because that's overwhelmingly the response, is people don't want that. They don't like it, right? People usually say, well, going easy is boring, right? And they try to, And that's just an absolute bold-faced lie. Okay? Going slow is boring. That is the problem, is that when you take away people's second lactate threshold, when you take away their VO2 max, you're taking away this thing that they use to believe that they're better than they actually are. Like, if they were running 5-minute miles under actual lactate threshold, or doing 400 watts and being under actual lactate threshold, they wouldn't be saying it's boring. Not at all. Because it's not about it being easy, being boring. It's about accepting the fact that you're not very good relative to what you thought you were is difficult. And what you're doing then is you're challenging the way in which people experience that sense of mastery, because mastery is a feeling, right? It can be felt in action, but it can also be felt in terms of self-regard. So when you say, oh, that point up there that you think is a benchmark and has meaning and tells you something about yourself, that doesn't exist. Well, people aren't going to accept that because you're telling them that they don't have the level of mastery that they thought. That's the problem, right? And that's why tests where you can get numbers that are really big, right, are tests that are always going to be socially more likely to be successful, right? And this is the problem with coaching industry, is that the market incentive is to get people to pay for coaching services, not to give people the best guidance or advice, right? And so that you would think that those things would be aligned, but the problem is that the potential athlete doesn't necessarily know enough to determine that the training that they're being told to do is correct. So if you can give people this artificial sense of mastery, well, now they like the training, right? But if you feel like that's being taken from you, now you're not going to be so thrilled. And I think that, the other complication of this is, even with this inflated mastery point, of this inflated feeling of a mastery point, most of us already feel like that isn't even good enough. And so, we're clinging desperately to whatever position we have on our scale in our mind of what the hierarchy towards, top ultimate performance is. And so then to have to accept that you're even further away from what you already think basically isn't meeting your standard, I think is just too challenging for people's brains. And you want to talk about willpower, if willpower exists at all, which I'm different maybe consideration, but that would be an act of willpower. The willpower of modesty, right? Or the willpower of self-awareness, the willpower of realism, right? And, the other thing to me that's ironic is that when I talk to people about this stuff, we're not taking away your 5K time or your 20-minute peak power. Those are still the same. Those haven't changed. And yet somehow, even though nobody's saying those aren't your best times, people are rejecting that, right? Oh, no, because I need this other thing, right? So, why is that the case? Because, it does mean that acknowledging that the gap is greater than you think, right? Than what you thought when your 20-minute peak power was branded as FTP. But the other thing is that you're deluding yourself, right? FTP is a delusion, right? There's no real correlation, I believe, between FTP and real performance, okay, except in the scale of 20-minute power, right? Just like your 5K is your best 5K. It doesn't mean you're going to run like that all the time. It's not meaningful. So we're reducing the feeling of mastery because we're saying that their psychological framework for challenge is wrong. So the identity is being challenged, the ego is being challenged, the framework of achievement is being challenged. So when people go to a workout class and it's overwhelming, their sense of self-worth is being challenged. And so what do people do? Do they say, oh, that's too hard, let me make an adjustment? No. They say, okay, let me go find some drugs that I can take to alter my consciousness to enough of an extent so that I can still feel that I can do this because I need that for my ego. And I get it, because I used to get quite frustrated about, that sense of challenge of mastery. For a lot of us, I think something that we'd like to try to hang our hat on is like, well, I may not be as fast as whatever, but I can do the hard things, right? And, I have the ability to be resilient and persevere through adversity, exhibit mental toughness. And, now, my feeling is, who cares if people don't think that I have mental toughness, because they don't think that my data or my numbers, and my results are on Strava or wherever they could see that. If they don't think that's good enough, why does that matter? It doesn't. Whether they feel X or Y, the reality is that's not helping me get where I want anyway, right? Which is, I want to get to the point where I feel that, I am really have that sense of personal mastery, where I'm doing things that, 5 weeks ago, 5 months ago, I couldn't do, right? And that, okay, I'm advancing, and now I'm feeling great, through the act of doing this stuff, because of the way in which I'm experiencing the satisfaction of improvement. So can we validate this all in some way, or is this just sort of overwhelmingly abstract? That brings me to two pieces of evidence. The first one category, I try to talk about this maybe a little bit more physiologically. So there's some interesting bits and pieces of research that try to look at the impact of applying too great of a training load on the mitochondria. And I don't mean specifically applying too great of a training load directly to the mitochondria, but what is the impact on the mitochondria, right? And we then also need to recognize we're talking about that as a proxy for aerobic respiration, or, right, usually in endurance sports, the vernacular is just sort of, being aerobic, that more efficient, comfortable, sustainable state. So we're talking about, you apply these training loads to the athlete, and then what do you see happen with that? And there's been some research that says that excess exercise can harm mitochondria. Now, there are also, to be fair, a mountain, if not mountains of publications of research and papers, people trying to demonstrate that HIIT causes mitochondrial biogenesis. And I think some of that is popular because in a public health domain, the idea that, well, you can have people do 5 to 20 minute periods of exercise a couple times a week, and you can get all of these additional benefits. This order of magnitude, beyond what you can get if you're just leading the typical Western sedentary, I go to work, I drink alcohol, I watch sports, I go to bed lifestyle. And I understand, the argument for that, but this is not a, public health, should people do a minimum level of physical activity a week? And if so, what should that be? We're talking about, how do you really show, getting to the point of, have I maximized my ability as an individual to perform at any given endurance sports, or, as a multi-sport endurance athlete, which I think most people, after, maybe a period of college sports, or, focusing on one particular sport at an elite level, I think most people tend to gravitate into being multi-sport endurance athletes. So now, when we look at these studies, right, that say HIIT creates, does create mitochondrial biogenesis, it has a positive effect. One question I always ask is, as controlled against what, right? Because when you compare it against doing nothing, well, any kind of physical activity is going to be stimulative. But these studies are never going to be compared against, say, the optimally implemented, Arthur Lydiard approach with his athletes, or, the correctly interpreted and implemented Class Lux Easy interval method. Partly because it's just very difficult for people to interpret those programs correctly. With high intensity training, it's actually very easy to identify what you're doing, relatively speaking, because you just go really hard for X number of minutes, and it's easy to define the boundaries and the parameters of the work because you're operating usually below the point of failure. But when you're looking at, these other intensities, right, that are really, I'm arguing across, the whole scope of this podcast, are what's more effective, these easier intensities, then it becomes difficult, because how do we know if we're going sufficiently easy? And, it's that whole idea of people trying to do the hero workout or, hit these, grand slam home runs, and when really you're just trying to set yourself up strategically to every day, how can what I do today not compromise my ability to do what I need to do tomorrow? And instead, people are thinking about the numbers and how can they get to that, measured outcome, right? That how can they feel that sense of mastery or competence versus thinking about, well, how can I really be a little bit more like mindful in terms of what's my strategy and how can I best execute the strategy, right? People sort of immediately throw the strategy out the window the second they're not getting the gratification that they think they deserve. So I think that your control for any kind of like hit is the awesome way to improve aerobic capacity, right? Improve lactate threshold. Well, one of those controls, whether it's the control or one of the controls, needs to be like the best possible execution of sub LT. And for all of the heretics out there who keep buying into this LT1, LT2, or even worse, the 2 millimole, 4 millimole bullshit, right? I guess we'll say LT1 so that you understand what we're talking about. But that sub-true lactate threshold, or what people erroneously call lactate threshold 1, we need that as a benchmark. Now, that's a program that plays out over the long term. And if executed correctly, what we should be seeing are significant accumulating benefits over time versus high-intensity interval training, which is just very much inherently unsustainable. You just can't execute over that time scale. So the reality is that we already know that we introduce too much stress, we see declined performance. And, right, this goes back to overtraining, and we've talked about overtraining on this podcast at length. And that's something that, always has to be considered and, revisited, because that is you're either training well or you're under training or you're overtraining, right? There aren't that many possible basic states that you can be in as an athlete pursuing sport and pursuing performance goals in sport. So going back to the findings of this study, it suggested that people experienced a significant and immediate decline in mitochondrial function as soon as they started overreaching on that high-intensity interval training. And I think usually the guideline for actually effective HIIT is to do it like twice a week and then basically do essentially nothing else, because your body's so trashed that it's very difficult to really do anything anyway without just getting more exhausted or making it so that you get to your next HIIT session and you're just too dead to do anything. And so then you're left in a situation where you're doing very, very little cumulative exercise. And then if you don't execute or respond well to those 2 sessions, you're basically going to see nothing anyway. And the alternative is people do see some response, but I think that's a short-term scale of response. So even if we want to equivocate and say, well, the body of evidence that says, overreaching with HIIT has a noticeably significant adverse effect on mitochondria, even if you want to say, well, that body of evidence just doesn't weigh against all the research supporting HIIT, we nonetheless, have to acknowledge the reality that, again, when you induce too much intensive training stress, when training intensity is increased too much and too frequently, and with too much volume as the way to lever the training load, then you see declined performance. And not to the point where people simply taper back at the end of a 3 month, say, training period to their quote unquote peak. We're talking about to the point where people have noticeably reduced lactate thresholds and absolute functional performance is down, and resting doesn't make it go away. And people basically have to sort of reset in the sense that now they have dropped off, and now they have to find a way to sort of recuperate that and build that back up. So people are literally getting out of shape training in this way, which might be kind of the more meaningful evidence than talking about impacts on mitochondria. If you want something that's more easy to see for the eye test, it's people who aren't fit. And I've talked to a lot of different folks who have this experience, to the point where I think I present as being like I have a crystal ball and I know what they're going to say, but it's the chronic endemic problem of athletes being pushed through these like dogmatic, well, you do these workouts and that's how you get good, and horses for courses, some of us just aren't going to be good, and then no consideration of the fact again that the training is the inherent issue. There was a guy I went to college with and was on the team, and he ended up running a 150 flat. I don't know. I want to say he ran just under 150, but certainly 150 flat in the 800 meters. And, well, if you could run 150, you should be running about 402 to 404 in the mile. And his best ever run was a 415 at BU, so basically a 420 mile. And, no negative energy towards this individual. Great runner, great guy. But, my argument would be that, like, he did not have the aerobic capacity developed through his training process to be able to take what he could do for the half mile and apply that to running the mile, right? Now, some people would say that, well, again, horses for courses. He's an 800-meter runner. 800-meter runners, they can't always run the mile, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's what we think is true, because that's what our Gestalt view of how training works tells us to think. And, it's an opportunity cost in training for sure, because the way the half-milers were training at Bates, at least at this time, is they were going out and they were going mental, right? Emptying the tank on the workouts on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then basically doing nothing the rest of the week. They would jog around the indoor track with a tennis ball while the rest of us were out trying to run 8 or 10 miles, in the snow and ice all winter. I'm not sure if they were doing their tennis ball catch runs because they had a concept of recovery. I think they just didn't really want to go outside, and they weren't really interested in doing any running, besides the intervals. And I'm sure they were also pretty fatigued. So, yeah, you would see some pretty good, pretty respectable half-miling performances, but that was it. And those results were pretty unpredictable. They were not like, oh, yeah, so-and-so is going to go out and do this. It was sort of like a couple of years there was this phenomena where in the outdoor season they would go off to whatever meet, and then they would come back and, oh, we broke the school record in the 4x8 again. And it seemed like that just happened every single year I was there, and it was just guys running out of their mind all of a sudden. But it's like, well, where was that performance all along? Now, I wasn't a part of that process, so I'm sure they'd maybe have a different perspective, right? But I think, again, it's an opportunity cost that by focusing on that basically high-intensity interval training, they got some benefits. But we didn't have a great middle distance running group overall, and we didn't have a particularly great cross-country team compared to what probably we should have been able to, given the fundamental, speed that these people had. And, I think if we had developed more aerobically and then, more appropriately applied the faster running, you would have had the great 800 meter times, but also 1500 meter times and 5K times and 10K times and 8K cross country times, etc. So I also think that, the other suggestion from this finding from this particular piece of research, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is it seems to be suggesting that the ATP production goes down the tubes as a consequence of this mitochondrial decline, or this adverse mitochondrial effect, which I think also shows, by the way, again, that peak oxygen uptake and VO2 max is massively overrated, because it has to be dependent on the scope and the function of the mitochondria, because the role of the oxygen is to just pair off and make water through that electron transport chain, right? So you can't have these electron transport chain occurring unless you have the mitochondrial scale, in a sense, to if you want to think about topographically, right, to be happening at these locations. So, and the other aspect here is that most people aren't saying, okay, well, geez, let me reduce my training by 80% and just focus on doing 2.5 sessions on average of high intensity interval training every week, otherwise doing nothing. And I don't think that's really ever been the approach. Is people have always tried to train more frequently at higher intensity. So I think it was in Running to the Top, there's a part, I think, where Lydiard talks about how earlier marathoners would go out and just sort of do 15 to 35 kilometer runs extremely hard at like every other day. And then the days when they weren't doing these runs, they were just going for walks, which, to us, it seems like at first glance, oh, that's so antiquated. They didn't know they needed to run every day. But they were probably walking because they were just obliterated. And I think he suggested that too, right? They couldn't do anything else. So that's another problem, is just that behaviorally athletes aren't willing to do that, because there's still this belief that it's not, as the irony is that the HIIT people are like, oh, mileage is bad, but then they still will go out and they still try to do running. And sometimes they're worse because the running they do might not be as much, but they're running those runs also fast, because then it's like, oh, everything has to be fast above a certain point in order to be productive, or else, I'm leaving money on the table. But even if you're working and the right so-called protocol for HIIT, it's still just massively less efficient than correctly executed aerobic training. But the perception is that it's by reaching to the higher level of intensity of work and then sustaining that for long enough that transformation will occur. In the New York Times article about this research, I think what they reported is, and I think it's worth again reiterating this, but they reported that these people who worked out strenuously almost every day had dramatic and rapid declines in mitochondrial function. Now there's different, secondhand reporting of new study finds, blah, 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 all from around the time period of spring of 2021. So maybe these different sources are all just sort of reporting back to the same source study. So maybe there's only actually been one study. But again, the finding isn't that HIIT can't improve fitness. Obviously it can, and I'm not saying it can't. What I am saying is that the concept of overtraining HIIT-wise is very easy to do, and it's unrecognized. Because the other aspect of this is that a lot of people are basically doing high-intensity training on runs that they think are easy, and trying to, again, right, that what's the problem or the challenge, really? The problem and the challenge is convincing people that they're training too hard is extremely difficult, because I think of the way in which it is a threat to people's ego and a threat to their sense of self-esteem as an athlete. And I tell people, you can't go hard like that. And then they, oh yeah, right. And then they do that for a couple of weeks, and then they fall off the wagon, and then they just go back to smashing it. And then they get back into the same problems. And it's like, this has never worked for you before. Why do we keep going back to it? And I honestly wonder if people experience sometimes like genuine feelings of anxiety when they're trying to control and reduce their training intensity, because it's just everything is screaming at them in their brain that they're not doing enough, and they just feel the elasticity of effort, the ability to go faster. So I think another question, though, is like, if we have evidence that HIIT can be productive, why is it after basically the minimum dose, it starts to become, a form of toxicity, right? Which is another way to say is, well, because what it looks like then is, well, why is the body so reluctant to respond to training anyway? Well, if we don't create a meaningful and genuinely meaningful epigenetic pressure, then why would the body want to change in the first place? right? So we're exhausting ourselves or under training most of the time, and finding the sweet spot is clearly more challenging for us than a lot of people can recognize. And it's difficult to recognize for the same reason that people can't recognize they're training too hard in the first place, right? Which again is that the grass is greener on the other side. We look at this person, they're better than me, then they can train harder. Well, of course they're going to do better numbers than you. They're better than you, right? But if you could do those numbers, then you'd already be doing them with your current effort, because your chances are, even when you're not trying to push yourself, you're still probably training too hard. So if we define HIIT as only a maximum possible exertion for 8 by 400 meters running, or 4 by 5 minutes swimming or skiing or biking or in the pool or whatever, right? Something where you're doing each rep to failure, then, we say, okay, well, look at, there's 2 of those a week. So they're only doing HIIT 2 times a week. So they're doing HIIT the right way. They're not responding. So I guess they're just not a good athlete. But if the athletes aren't being calibrated, or if you aren't calibrated properly for all of the other sessions, all of a sudden you're doing HIIT all of the time. So one of the core issues here, as we often point out, is the milieu of training, right? That social environment in which we find ourselves. And it's this mind over matter belief that people push through, right? And there's a difference between, I don't really feel like doing my homework, but I'm going to do my homework because I know I should do it, right? And that can maybe be then people complain, right? Oh, that's hard, that's uncomfortable, I hate doing it. Well, it's not actually hard, you just don't want to do it. And then, we invent narratives to try to make ourselves feel better about the fact that we're just basically unwilling to do things that are actually objectively and obviously in our self-interest. But, the building up of this mind over matter, no pain, no gain, this is an absolutely rancid thing to be taught to and imparted to athletes. And you see this play out even with people who talk about how they understand the central governor. Well, it's just as people with lactate testing have just superimposed their belief that, well, that's too easy, you have to train really hard. And so then they just fabricated this lactate threshold 2 point, even though, as I've said many times on the podcast, and I will keep saying, I guess, indefinitely, because it doesn't seem likely that I am single-handedly going to move the needle on this. There's no evidence from what we know about lactate to support the presence of a lactate threshold 2. And that's not just me saying this. There are other people with, doctorates, in sports physiology making the same observation, right? And then you share this evidence with people and they just nope, I'm still not accepting this, right? It's just they need that intensity to be tangible. They need that to be real, because otherwise, again, it's just the pins holding together their worldview are falling apart. But then people, then do this with the central governor, and they say, well, so we could use the central governor because actually what you're doing is you're training the central governor to allow yourself to do higher levels of work. So the central governor is giving you permission. And at first, it was kind of what I thought might be true. And as I've thought about this more and looked into this more, it's actually become apparent to me that is definitely not the case, because that implies that there's a secondary consciousness that our consciousness is not aware of, and that's occupied by the central governor, and the central governor can choose, in a sense, to allow things differently. And I don't think that makes any sense, right? That's people, again, taking this idea of well, the higher intensity is what is, you're trained this, mind-body duality, that your conscious self has to kick the shit out of your body and your unconscious mind to make it be what it wants, because the rest of you is weak and it's only your conscious self that is strong, and you must control your, your fallen nature, right? And all that, axial age religious stuff, right? That, people bleed into their understandings of these things, I think, without even realizing it. What I want to suggest is that if we didn't have these sociocultural influences around training at high intensity and, utilizing, this framework of mind over matter, of punish yourself, transformation, through fire kind of thing, that we would never train hard. And I think that happens specifically because of the central governor. Okay? So all biological mechanisms should be explained in the context of natural selection. Now, usually one of the things I dislike about sports training books is they lead with a physiology chapter, which is usually very, in my opinion, uninformed, even from a lay perspective. It's pretty uninformed, and it's very regurgitory, and it ultimately has no real connection to anything in the book. It's just this like obligatory, well, let's put some things in here about physiology from the physiology textbook, so it makes it sound like we know what we're doing, and then we're just going to go on and say whatever we think, and we're not actually, most people are not rationalizing or explaining it in that context, but it's just this like form to the genre, to the literature that is unbelievably tedious to have to work through. And you kind of read through it anyway because you're like, well, maybe this time it will be different, and it's not. It's like an abusive relationship. It never gets better, no matter how many times you convince yourself it's going to be different. So, this idea that you're training the central governor, I don't think that's true, right? And if we explain this in terms of like natural selection, right, versus the idea of like, well, how do these things exist for peak sports performance? Well, the kinds of stuff we do in peak sport performance is not actually very good in terms of survival, because it leaves us like incredibly like sore and injured and exhausted and just lying around, right? And it's actually the ability to push yourself to exhaustion, ironically, is only possible because we live in a society with more leisure available to more people than at any other point in time, to where you can exhaust yourself and then it's, hey, you know what? You can do nothing the next day except lie on the couch and eat Skittles and play video games, right? Well, there's no like, that kind of counterbalance is not a mechanism that is going to exist kind of more naturally, where, if we think about this concept, right, like how is that something that would be selected for, right, naturally? How would that be like a beneficial trait, the ability to be wrecked and then be totally trashed and unable to do anything? And it really also goes against the idea of, I don't know how much weight you really want to put into this, but, whatever the evidence there is around like persistence hunting suggests that, well, human endurance wasn't based on going absolutely ham for 4 minutes or even 2 hours or even 8 hours. That's actually very poor on the scale of persistence hunting, right? So if we think about this like epigenetics, right? Well, that means epigenetics and the regulation of epigenetic responses, which I think must be happening via the central governor, right? Because like the brain is regulating everything in the body, has to go through the brain in some way. Well, that's a selected trait, right? So like this epigenetic capacity, the capacity to have epigenetic responses, variable epigenetic responses, I think is a energy saving trait, because it means we're not always just automatically dumping all of our energy into having maxed out physical potential. And so we only spend enough energy to adapt based on the environment. And then the central governor is in place, I think, in part to help facilitate that regulation. And there's another layer to this that I'm going to suggest too. So we know logically that energy efficiency has to be selected for in terms of natural selection. So the ability to make aerobic epigenetically driven adaptations is then in turn going to be selected for, because it allows us to find the maximum point of efficiency in our environment. So, and it just functions along the basic math of opportunity cost, where anaerobic glycolysis is going to give you 2 ATP, phosphate creatine is like 1 ATP, and aerobic respiration is like 28 to 32. So, okay, one of those is obviously more efficient, right? So per inputted unit, right, you're getting a vast difference in ATP production. So then if we need an adaptation, what epigenetics is allowing for is it's allowing for that to occur. So how does this happen? Well, and how do you get those to be aerobic, and why does it make sense that we wouldn't ever naturally work out in these high intensity zones? Because the pain from the central governor should be acting to keep us in a state where we are getting maximum stimulus towards the most efficient possible adaptation. So guess what? The second you cross out of or cross over lactate threshold, your responses of resistance and discomfort start going up. It's, and so that's why it feels so good to run and work out below threshold, because the central governor wants us to be there. Like, we want to be there because that's the most efficient point to adapt, right? And so by working out in that state, we are best going to get the epigenetic response for the best possible aerobic development. If we could get more efficient by training at a harder state, then the central governor wouldn't regulate our behavior out of that intensity, right? Or down-regulate our behavior to an easier intensity. It would do the opposite. It would regulate us into the behavior that is going to most efficiently get us to the most efficient adaptation. To my mind, that makes sense when you think about this from an evolutionary perspective. When you think about it from a sports performance perspective or from a peak sports performance perspective, now it doesn't make sense anymore, because you're thinking about this in terms of like these contrived, sort of like natural forms of activity. Like if you run a marathon and you're paralyzed, if you did that in the state of nature, you're going to die. I mean, the amount of time that it takes people to recover, your body doesn't know you're going to have food abundance, right? That's not being selected for. No, I will say that, where does the hit come from in this? Well, I think the ability to compensate for suddenly rough or more traumatic conditions has also been selected for, and we do have that flexibility. And of course, what do we see? It's not sustainable, as seen from the myriad physical and mental health problems that always arise for people who try to sustain that. So if there is like a dramatic, sudden stress in the environment, the ability to go into overdrive, people can do that, right? But then you're going to pay the price later, which is another reason why the central governor doesn't want that to function. So I don't think that we're training the central governor up to open the door for us to go harder or do different things. I think that the central governor is an automatic system of regulation that has come to be because of the fact that it can push us into a state where we are going to be more efficient, and we are also going to be able to most efficiently adapt to be the most efficient in whatever the environment is. And that's a trade-off, right? Because, hey, you know what? How much energy do we need? Okay, this is taking more energy now to survive. Let's make this adaptation. Well, yes, it will take a little bit of an investment to create these and sustain these, new levels of mitochondria, let's say. But ultimately, right, this is actually more cost effective. And I don't think there's any reason to assume that organisms wouldn't be rewarded for functioning in that way. And over the course of 3 billion years of evolution, there's plenty of opportunity to arrive at that point. So I said that there were like kind of two major areas. So the second thing is less physiological and more so psychological. And this, we touched upon this a little bit, right, in terms of how people experience mastery. What does mastery mean? In what ways does changing to saying that the issue is me, I am actually not improving because I'm already trying to train too hard. What psychology is making this so complex for us to recognize? So I think that there is evidence in psychology that when we experience a sense that we are achieving or making progress towards our goals, it does a lot to upregulate tendencies. And I watch people do things that are completely ineffective with tremendous dedication, because as long as in their paradigm they feel they are getting to where they want to be, then everything is good in the hood and they're not going to do anything differently. So that is where they're getting into their flow state. But the flow state is not a inherent absolute thing. It is something that is a product of social construction, right? Because it's a psychological thing. We are experiencing that, because of the combination of our expectations and our self-regard, and society around us is determining what our self-regard should be and what the expectations we should have for ourselves should be, right? That's coming from our external environment. So we need to achieve that flow state in the correct way, because it's very easy to direct the psychosocial tendencies of engagement into the wrong direction. So in some sense, the argument for flow psychology has been a result of the belief that there's a certain idea of maximum challenge to maximum skill. And like if you go and you just look this up online and you go to the Wikipedia article, you see this sort of like very colorful, pinwheel type matrix where flow is achieved starting at the point of medium challenge, medium skill level, and then expanding outward to a greater degree as you get to higher challenge and higher skill level. And when you look at the book published, The Flow, in 1990, the way this is diagrammed is as a quote-unquote flow channel, where when challenge is too high for skill, you experience anxiety. And when skill is too high for challenge, you experience boredom. And then all the way up from low to high, when you have balance, right, then you are experiencing a flow state. So this idea that you have to go super hard in order to not be bored is false. You just have to have a clearer or better understanding of what the appropriate challenge is, and then, match the skill to that. And I think that actually the irony is that people do experience anxiety trying to train easier because their skill at executing that is so incredibly poor that the challenge is too intensive and it becomes stress-inducing and anxiety-inducing, and they can't handle it, and so they revert back to what they're familiar with in their comfort zone, which ironically is the uncomfortable zone, because that's what they think is effective. And it also comes back to the comparison is the thief of joy concept after all, because people continuously, right, and people don't need Strava to do this stuff. There's this whole messed up thing in our culture right now where technology's changing, our behavior in the brain is being rewired. I very much doubt that. I don't think the brain is being any more rewired than we've rewired our brain with any of the other crazy stuff that humans have invented and put out into its social space. But Strava isn't the problem. People have always found ways to compare themselves to others, right? We're very good at that. And when you look at what you're doing and you're thinking about, well, how can I chase the numbers? Then you're not going to be able to execute your strategy. And you need to be thinking about the strategy and saying, well, how can I position myself effectively to improve? And just let go of the numbers. Make sure your intensity isn't too high. Work with somebody to figure out how to do that. And that's a challenge, because you have to be willing to really work with socially that coach, and then that coach has to obviously in turn understand what they're doing. But that idea that like low challenge and low skill is, in the Wikipedia representation, well, that's where you have apathy and people who are indifferent. One way to demonstrate that this simply isn't the case is look at how much fun little kids have building crappy little forts in the woods, or whatever other kinds of games they play, or playing in the sandbox, or doing anything, right? People at a very low skill level doing things that have what, as we reach adulthood, we don't consider to be remotely challenging, are extremely immersed in it, right? And perhaps more so because they don't have that level of awareness for comparison yet. And as people become more aware of what other people are doing, and then you're encouraged to see what you do in the context of where other people are, then you start to learn to feel worse and worse about yourself as you go. So, it's really that challenge needs to be matched to the skills, right? Not that we're trying to take our skills and match them to the challenge. And, I see this in education all the time, right? There's a persistent mindset that, we need to make this hard. No, we don't need to match that way. What we need to do is we need to match the task to the skill level. We need to determine the skill, match the task to the skill level. And that's like where, athletes, right, people will engage with a coaching system that tells them to go hard and go easy because they have more cognitive and behavioral skills around there. But when you're telling people to go low and slow, you can sort of demonstrate to people why this makes sense, but then they don't engage. They don't communicate, because if they're not talking about the struggle, like what is there to talk about? And so like a lot of times people just don't even have the social skills needed to engage with that stuff. And coaches are responsible, obviously, for inducing the false concept of what is and isn't productive. And, I would say for my part, I really do feel I spent the better part of 20 plus years struggling with running in particular, because I always thought I was trying to find the flow state that I very, very occasionally would reach on some runs. And it was eye-opening for me to learn that the state that I thought was threshold was 4.8 millimoles when I actually needed to be at 0.8 millimole. And I even went through a phase where I was still working out at, close to 2 millimole. Because again, I just couldn't accept that reduction in intensity. I couldn't also accept, how slow I was. And then I got into trouble doing that because I still managed to overreach. It just took a little bit longer. And when you learn the wrong concept of how it should feel to train, you're never going to be successful with that medium of training, because no matter how much you believe it or rationalize it or convinced it's true, if it's not what works, it's not what works, right? The success of a training method is based on how effective it is, not based on how effective somebody has convinced themselves that it is. There's this interesting body of research from Andreas Weinhorst, who is a former, world-class level, international level triathlete, and then did a PhD with Tim Noakes as Tim Noakes' doctoral student. And he studied why is it that people basically feel better when they're in first place than when they're in last place. And, I don't want to make a false representation of myself and say that I'm somehow an expert on that area or that domain. But, as I've, looked at some of this stuff, I started reflecting on how I've had this experience a lot, and I imagine other people have. If I'm doing exercise or working out with somebody less fit, I usually feel great. And their struggle is changing how I experience exercise. So for me, right, the thief of their joy in terms of that comparison is that comparison is favoring me. But when I work out with somebody better than me, it's the exact opposite. It's horrible. Maybe like one time it can be like, oh, that was really challenging, and I feel good about myself because I overcame that adversity. But that ultimately really is not going to be the sustainable experience that then just becomes exhaustive. Kind of like with high intensity training, is like at first it's like the ego boost you get from, wow, I'm doing these things and I'm watching the numbers go up. A friend of mine, Noah Gothier, made the point that like the sort of rise and then decline of the Peloton indoor bikes was at first everybody was getting addicted to it because they were watching the numbers go up, and then eventually they just leveled off. And I think that's what happens for most people, is they just sort of go out and then they sort of get out of shape, and then they kind of go out and do some stuff, and they get to whatever kind of that initial response is, and then they're just locked in at that point and they just stay there. And that's been true for me, and that's true for a lot of people I know. I think the difficulty is trying to recognize that and say, look, I've never gotten any better for years and years and years training it this way. And even if I wanted to push it more intensively, you just can't, because it just falls apart, right? So even in the world in which that was better, it doesn't matter because it's not accessible. So, another way, though, to think about this idea is that when people are in first place, then it feels like our skill, right, is being matched by the challenge. But if we're getting dropped, then that changes. And that shows how our social construction of the challenge influences our experience of easy and competence. So I think that's maybe another aspect of that is people don't feel comfortable, right, going easy because, the challenge is not matched to their skill level appropriately. So changing the level is going to be the regulator here. And we have to think more divergently about the challenge. Now, Magnus Ditlev, a triathlete, podcast listener from Sweden, kindly sent me some of this stuff, and I watched and listened to it a couple times. And some of the things that stood out to me, they had a Sweat Elite podcast, which I thought was kind of underwhelmingly uninformative and very cliche. But the workout video I thought was a little bit more interesting. And he talked about how basically he'd only done in polarized training zone 1 since the start of his training for the year. And, in this workout video on YouTube, he's on the bike, he's doing some 30-minute efforts at, 300 to 350, 370, 380 watts, and he's at 1.5 millimole, very low. And then he goes out and he's running after that some 16-minute 5Ks at 1.1 millimole. But then he also then talks about how, I do these workouts, they feel, and the goal of this workout was, I got to practice and replicate the race, which to me was like, okay, here's a huge red flag. This is definitely a problem. And so then I was not surprised to hear the comments about how, I can do these workouts and then I can't always execute what I can do in the workouts and the races I can in training. So to me, it's like, so you got to the point where you could do this crazy workout off of just training below, right, in polarized zone 1. So again, for those of you dualityists, below lactate threshold 1. So he basically, right, is making deposits and not withdrawals. And then when he starts doing workouts like this, he's making withdrawals. And it's like, how can you, this idea of simulating racing, how can you simulate racing without doing racing effort? You can't, right? If that's what you're thinking about doing it in training terms versus sitting there and playing a triathlon video game. So if you're inducing race effort with all of a sudden, and then you get to the actual race and it's not there, well, isn't that because you made those withdrawals leading up to that process? But you got in really good shape doing LT1. Why would you just suddenly say, I guess it's time to stop? This has been working really well and I've been making huge improvements. I will now stop doing this. But that's basically what people do, because this sense of, okay, now I have to do the HIIT because that's where all these good things are going to happen. But you only got to the fitness only goes up when you're doing the LT1, and then they start doing this stuff and it's like, okay, you can get faster, but is your efficiency improving? No, you're just running faster, or swimming faster, riding faster, skiing faster. And this is an example of artificially making it impossible to engage with a workload, right? To bring out a maximization of absolute skill. So by we're going to do this workout and we're going to simulate the race challenge, right? Now you're changing the psychological parameters to access a flow state, which makes it possible to execute this training. And because you're now maxing out and tapping out the limits of your skill, then this leads to fatigue. And again, training like this increases pain, injury, sort of those feelings of muscular paralysis, if you will, from just being so sore and so destroyed. And then into the more, significant issues, eating disorders, people start thinking the problem is I'm too fat, mental health, self-loathing, disillusionment. And don't get me wrong, I admire what people can do at the top level. It's very impressive, but I'm not so foolish as to assume that knowledge scales in proportion to performance, and neither should you be so foolish as to think that. Reducing intensity is the answer, not increasing it. And it's harder to go easy than to go hard because of the landscape of culture and our own ingrained psychological habits of self-regard. And that's what a great coach should be able to work with you on. That's what a great athlete should be able to do. It's not about simply writing down trash on a calendar, right? It's then coaching that schedule, right? Helping people execute that. The intensity of work is the essential mechanism of training, and we need to be better at recognizing that the grass is not always greener on the other side. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out some of our other content on the podcast. If you know other folks who might find this stuff interesting, recommend this episode or another episode to them. And if you have any questions or thoughts or things you'd like to hear us cover, or you're looking for maybe some consultation or guidance on your own training, you can reach out to us, send us a message on our Instagram page at Black Cats Run, or you can send us an email, blackcatsrunpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.